Wir müssen die Linie sofort halten.
Jawohl, Herr General. Die Panzer sind unterwegs.
Die Lage ist kritisch.
They thought it would be another slow war. Trenches, stalemates, and years of bloodshed just like before. But in the early hours of May 1940, everything changed. Without warning, German forces unleashed a strategy the world had never truly seen at this scale: the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks didn't wait for infantry. Planes didn't just scout, they destroyed. Communication lines were shattered in hours. Entire armies were outmaneuvered before they even understood what was happening. France, one of the strongest military powers in the world, believed it had time to react. It didn't. In just days, the German advance cut through defenses like they didn't exist, leaving chaos, confusion, and fear in its wake. Instead of attacking where everyone expected, German commanders made a bold and almost unthinkable move. They pushed their armored divisions through the dense Ardennes forester region the Allies believed was impossible for tanks to cross. That single decision changed everything. While Allied forces rushed north to defend Belgium, German panzer divisions burst through the weak point, driving straight toward the English Channel. In a matter of days, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were trapped, cut off, surrounded. The speed was terrifying. Entire units collapsed without ever firing a shot. Radios failed. Orders never arrived. It wasn't just a military defeat, was psychological warfare at its most devastating level. As German forces reached the coast, the world watched in disbelief. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French troops, were pushed into a desperate corner at Dunkirk. With nowhere left to run, survival seemed impossible. But what followed became one of the most dramatic evacuations in history. Hundreds of civilian boats crossed the English Channel under constant threat of air attacks, rescuing over 300,000 soldiers. It was called a miracle, but, make no mistake, it was also a massive retreat. Germany had achieved something no one thought possible. In just 6 weeks, France fell. A global superpower collapsed faster than anyone could comprehend. But the real shock wasn't just the speed. It was what it revealed about modern warfare. Strategy had changed forever. Defense lines meant nothing against mobility and surprise. Coordination between air and ground forces became the new standard. And the world realized something terrifying. Wars would no longer be measured in years, but in weeks or even days. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a victory, it was a warning. A glimpse into a future where hesitation meant defeat, and where the next attack could come faster than anyone was ready for. The fall of France didn't just shock Europe, it sent a chilling message across the entire world. If a nation with one of the largest armies on Earth could collapse in just weeks, then who was safe? Panic spread through governments and military commands alike. Leaders began to realize they were not prepared for this new kind of war. Old strategies, once considered reliable, were now completely obsolete. Speed had become the ultimate weapon, and Germany had mastered it. Every victory added to the myth of invincibility surrounding their forces, making enemies hesitate, even before the first shot was fired. But behind this terrifying efficiency was a level of coordination rarely seen before. German commanders relied heavily on precise timing, constant communication, and aggressive decision-making. Tank divisions didn't wait for permission, they acted on opportunity. Air support wasn't delayed, it arrived exactly when needed. This synchronization created a relentless momentum that was nearly impossible to stop. Once the attack began, it didn't slow down. It didn't pause. It kept pushing forward, exploiting every weakness, every hesitation, every mistake made by the enemy. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers on the front lines often had no clear idea of where the enemy was or how fast they were advancing. One moment they were holding a position. The next, they were completely surrounded. Rumors spread faster than facts, and fear began to take control. Units retreated not because they were defeated in combat, but because they believed they were already lost. In many cases, the battle was decided before it even truly began. German air superiority played a crucial role in maintaining this fear. Dive bombers, known for their terrifying sirens, would scream through the sky before striking their targets with precision. Bridges, supply routes, and defensive positions were destroyed in minutes. This constant pressure from above meant that enemy forces could never regroup safely. Even when they attempted to reorganize, they were immediately targeted and disrupted. The sky itself became a weapon, turning every movement into a risk. As the campaign continued, the speed of the German advance only increased. Supply lines somehow kept up, reinforcing the illusion that their resources were endless. In reality, they were taking huge risks, stretching their logistics to the limit. But their gamble paid off. Every day that passed made it harder for the Allies to mount any kind of organized defense. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information, leading to costly mistakes that only accelerated the collapse. One of the most critical failures on the Allied side was underestimating the enemy's intent. They expected a repeat of World War I, a slow, grinding conflict. Instead, they faced something entirely different. Their defensive lines were built for a war that no longer existed. By the time they realized this, it was already too late. The Germans had bypassed their strongest positions and were attacking where they were weakest. Even communication became a battlefield. German forces used radio systems far more effectively than their opponents, allowing real-time coordination between units. This gave them a massive advantage. While Allied commanders struggled to send and receive orders, German troops were constantly adapting, reacting instantly to changing conditions. This flexibility turned chaos into opportunity, allowing them to stay one step ahead at all times. The collapse of morale spread quickly among defending forces. Once a few units began to retreat, others followed. It created a chain reaction that was almost impossible to stop. Soldiers who had trained for years suddenly found themselves in a situation they didn't understand. The enemy wasn't where they were supposed to be. The front line no longer existed. Everything felt unpredictable, and that uncertainty was deadly. Despite the overwhelming success, not everything went perfectly for Germany. There were moments where their advance could have been stopped. Delays, miscommunications, and overconfidence created small windows of opportunity for the Allies. But those windows were never fully exploited. Whether due to hesitation or confusion, the chance to slow down the Blitzkrieg slipped away again and again. Meanwhile, civilians found themselves caught in the middle of the chaos. Entire cities were abandoned as people fled from the advancing forces. Roads became overcrowded with refugees, creating additional obstacles for both sides. The human cost of the rapid advance was immense, even beyond the battlefield. Fear wasn't limited to soldiers, consumed entire populations. As the campaign reached its final stages, resistance became more scattered and desperate. Without a clear strategy or stable leadership, coordinated defense was nearly impossible. German forces continued to push forward, capturing key locations and tightening their control. The outcome was no longer in doubt. It was only a matter of time when France officially surrendered. The shockwave was immediate. One of Europe's most powerful nations had fallen faster than anyone believed possible. The balance of power had shifted overnight. Germany now stood as the dominant force in Western Europe, and the rest of the world was forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about war. But perhaps the most dangerous consequence was the confidence this victory gave to German leadership. Success on this scale reinforced the belief that their strategy was unstoppable. It encouraged even more ambitious plans, pushing them toward future offensives that would shape the course of the entire war. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was a symbol of dominance. In the end, the lightning war that crushed France became one of the most studied military campaigns in history. Not just because of how fast it happened, but because of what it revealed. Warfare had evolved, and those who failed to adapt would be left behind. The lessons learned during those 6 weeks would echo throughout the rest of the war and far beyond it. In the months that followed, military leaders around the world scrambled to understand what had just happened. Reports were analyzed, strategies dissected, and every detail of the German advance was studied. How could such a powerful defense collapse so quickly? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just about tanks or planes. It was about how everything worked together. Speed, surprise, and coordination had formed a new kind of warfare, one that demanded immediate adaptation or guaranteed defeat. Some nations began to change their approach almost immediately. They invested in mobile units, improved communication systems, and restructured their command strategies. Others hesitated, believing that what happened in France was a unique situation that couldn't be repeated. That hesitation would prove dangerous, because Blitzkrieg wasn't a one-time tactic, it was a blueprint, and Germany was already preparing to use it again. The next target would push this strategy to its limits. Vast territories, harsh conditions, and a determined enemy would challenge everything that had made Blitzkrieg so successful. The same speed that worked in Western Europe would soon face new obstacles, long distances, extreme weather, and supply lines stretched thinner than ever before. It was no longer just about striking fast, but about sustaining that momentum under impossible conditions. At the same time, cracks began to appear beneath the surface of Germany's seemingly unstoppable machine. The rapid advances came at a cost. Equipment wore down. Troops became exhausted. Resources were consumed faster than they could be replaced. The illusion of endless strength started to fade, even if the victories continued for a while longer. What looked invincible from the outside was beginning to show signs of strain. Enemies of Germany also began to adapt. They studied the weaknesses of Blitzkrieg and searched for ways to counter it. Defensive strategies evolved, focusing on slowing down armored advances and disrupting coordination. Anti-tank weapons improved. Air defenses became stronger. Bit by bit, the elements that made Blitzkrieg so effective were being challenged. It was no longer an unstoppable force, it was a strategy that could be resisted. One of the biggest lessons learned was the importance of flexibility. Rigid plans no longer worked in a fast-moving battlefield. Commanders needed to think quickly, adapt constantly, and respond to changing situations in real time. Those who failed to do so were quickly overwhelmed. The battlefield had become unpredictable, and only those who embraced that unpredictability could survive. Technology also began to play an even greater role. Radios, vehicles, and aircraft were no longer just support tools, they were central to success. Nations that invested in innovation gained a critical advantage. The war was no longer just fought with soldiers, but with systems, coordination, and information. It marked the beginning of a new era where technological superiority could decide the outcome before the battle even started. Despite the growing resistance, the impact of the Blitzkrieg in France could never be undone. It had already changed the course of the war. It had already reshaped military thinking, and it had already proven that speed and coordination could defeat even the strongest defenses. The world had witnessed a transformation in warfare, and there was no going back. Historians would later look back at those 6 weeks as a turning point, not just in the war, but in military history as a whole. It wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration of what was possible. It forced every nation to rethink its strategies, its defenses, and its understanding of conflict. The ripple effects would be felt for decades, and even today, the legacy of Blitzkrieg remains. Modern military strategies still reflect the principles first demonstrated during that campaign: speed, precision, and coordination. What began as a shocking and devastating attack became a foundation for how wars are fought in the modern world. The Lightning War didn't just change one battle, it changed everything. As the war expanded beyond Western Europe, the reputation of German forces continued to grow. Stories of their speed and precision spread across continents, creating a psychological edge before battles even began. Opposing troops had already heard what happened in France, and many feared facing the same overwhelming force. This reputation alone became a weapon, weakening resistance and planting doubt in the minds of enemies long before the first engagement. However, confidence can quickly turn into overconfidence. As victories stacked up, some German commanders began to believe their tactics were unbeatable in any situation. This mindset led to riskier decisions, pushing deeper into enemy territory without fully securing their positions. What once was calculated aggression slowly started to blur into dangerous ambition, setting the stage for future challenges that would test the limits of their strategy. In the East, the scale of war changed dramatically. The terrain was vast, the infrastructure limited, and the resistance far more resilient than expected. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, but speed required stable supply lines. Those became harder to maintain over such enormous distances. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and constant resistance began to slow the once unstoppable advance. The lightning was still striking, but not with the same force. Weather soon became another powerful enemy. Harsh winters turned roads into frozen traps, immobilizing vehicles and crippling movement. Equipment that worked perfectly in Western Europe struggled under extreme conditions. Soldiers, unprepared for the cold, faced not only the enemy but the environment itself. The fast-paced warfare that defined Blitzkrieg began to stall, revealing a critical weakness. It depended heavily on favorable conditions. Meanwhile, enemy forces adapted with increasing effectiveness. They learned to create defensive depth, allowing initial breakthroughs while preparing counterattacks further behind the lines. Instead of collapsing under pressure, they absorbed it and responded strategically. This shift reduced the shock value of Blitzkrieg, turning rapid advances into prolonged and costly engagements that drained resources and morale. Another key factor was industrial capacity. While Germany relied on quick victories, its enemies began to leverage their ability to produce weapons, vehicles, and supplies on a massive scale. Over time, this production advantage started to tip the balance. Even if Blitzkrieg achieved early success, sustaining that success became more difficult against an opponent that could continuously rebuild and reinforce air superiority. Once a major strength also became contested. Enemy aircraft improved, defenses strengthened, and the skies grew more dangerous. Without full control of the air, coordination between ground and air forces weakened. The precise timing that made Blitzkrieg so effective began to break down, reducing its impact and increasing vulnerability on the battlefield. Communication, which had been a major advantage, now faced new challenges. As operations expanded across vast territories, maintaining clear and reliable communication became harder. Delays, interference, and confusion started to affect decisions. The fast, flexible command structure that once gave Germany an edge now struggled under the pressure of scale and complexity. Despite these growing challenges, the early success of Blitzkrieg continued to influence decisions at the highest levels. Leaders believed that one more decisive strike could turn the tide, that speed could still deliver victory. This belief led to continued offensives, even when conditions suggested a more cautious approach might be necessary. The strategy that once brought rapid success was now being pushed beyond its limits. At the same time, resistance movements began to emerge within occupied territories. These groups disrupted supply lines, gathered intelligence, and created constant pressure behind the front lines. While not always decisive on their own, their actions contributed to the overall strain on German operations, making it harder to maintain control and momentum. The longer the war continued, the clearer it became that Blitzkrieg was not designed for prolonged conflict. It excelled in short, decisive campaigns, but struggled in drawn-out wars of attrition. As battles stretched on, the advantages of speed and surprise diminished, replaced by the harsh realities of endurance, production, and resilience. Allied forces, having learned from early defeats, became more coordinated and strategic. Joint operations between nations improved, combining resources and knowledge to counter German tactics more effectively. This growing unity created a stronger, more adaptable opposition, one that could respond to Blitzkrieg with its own evolving strategies. Turning points began to appear. Battles that once would have ended in rapid German victories now resulted in stalemates or even defeats. Each of these moments chipped away at the image of invincibility. The psychological advantage that had once been so powerful started to fade, replaced by a growing sense that Germany could be stopped by the later stages of the war. Blitzkrieg was no longer the dominant force it had once been. Its principles still existed, but they were no longer enough to guarantee success. The battlefield had evolved again, shaped by experience, adaptation, and the relentless pressure of total war. What began as a revolutionary strategy had become just one part of a much larger and more complex conflict in the end. The story of Blitzkrieg is not just about rapid victories, it's about transformation. It showed the world how quickly warfare could change, how innovation could redefine power, and how even the most dominant strategies have limits. It remains one of the most powerful examples of how speed, coordination, and bold decision-making can alter history, but also a reminder that no advantage lasts forever.